Wyoming looks empty on a map, but that emptiness is misleading because this is a state bigger than entire countries, richer than most Americans realize, and yet somehow home to fewer people than a mid-sized city. It has vast mineral wealth, no income tax, world-famous national parks, and land that seems to stretch forever. So the question isn't why Wyoming is big, it's why so few people actually live here, and why, despite all that space and money, most never will. To understand Wyoming, you first have to understand scale. Wyoming covers nearly 98,000 square miles, which makes it the 10th largest state in the country. You can drive for hours in a straight line and pass more antelope than people, and east to west, the state stretches roughly 375 miles, while north to south it runs another 276. That kind of space usually comes with cities, corridors, sprawl, something. But in Wyoming, it mostly comes with silence. What really breaks your brain is this. Wyoming is actually larger than the United Kingdom, and while the UK holds nearly 68 million people, Wyoming holds about 587,000. That's not a typo. You could fit the entire population of Wyoming into a few London neighborhoods and still have room left over. Italy, another comparison, is only slightly larger, yet it holds more than 60 million people. Wyoming's emptiness isn't subtle, it's mathematical. 6 people per square mile, and in some counties it drops below 1. At that density, towns don't blur together. Instead, they exist like islands, separated by wind, distance, and long stretches of nothing at all. What makes this even stranger is how your brain reacts to that scale once you're actually there, because distances stop feeling abstract and start feeling physical. A nearby town might be an hour away, and a casual drive can quietly turn into a half-day commitment. In most states, population spreads outward like ink and water. In Wyoming, it doesn't spread at all, it pools. People cluster tightly around a few livable nodes, and then they vanish almost immediately beyond them. There's no gradual thinning, just a sharp edge where civilization ends and space takes over. That's why Wyoming feels emptier than the math suggests. The gaps aren't gentle, they're abrupt. A lot of people assume Wyoming is empty because no one bothered to move there, but that's only half true. The other half is that much of Wyoming was never really available in the first place. Nearly half of the entire state, around 47%, is federally owned land, which means national parks, national forests, and vast Bureau of Land Management territory where development is either heavily restricted or completely off-limits. So when you see endless open land, you're often looking at space that can't be built on, sold, or subdivided. Yellowstone alone removes millions of acres from the housing equation, and when you add in Grand Teton, multiple national forests, and BLM grazing land, Wyoming suddenly isn't as open as it looks. Even state-controlled land adds another layer of limitation.
The result is a strange illusion, a massive state where large portions are locked away by design. You don't sprawl across Wyoming the way you do Texas or Arizona. Instead, growth funnels into a handful of towns, while everything else stays frozen in time. This land structure also warps economics in subtle ways, because when development is constrained, housing supply doesn't respond normally to demand. You don't get new suburbs popping up to absorb population pressure. Instead, prices rise in the few places people are allowed to live, while vast surrounding areas remain functionally unusable. That's why Wyoming can feel both empty and expensive at the same time. The openness you see isn't an invitation, it's a boundary. And when nearly half your state can't be built on, growth doesn't scale, it bottlenecks. This is one of the quiet reasons Wyoming feels empty. The land exists, but much of it is intentionally untouchable, preserved for wildlife, minerals, grazing, and scenery rather than people.
And if you've lived in Wyoming or visited recently, I'd be interested to hear whether it felt as empty as the numbers suggest.
Once you zoom in from the map, the population story gets even stranger. Wyoming is the least populous state in America,
Not Alaska, not Vermont, Wyoming. As of 2024, fewer than 600,000 people live here, and nearly 70% of them are clustered into incorporated towns, which leaves enormous areas where human presence is barely detectable. The largest city, Cheyenne, barely cracks 65,000 people, while Casper, the second largest, sits just under 60,000. After that, the numbers fall off a cliff, and entire counties have populations smaller than some suburban high schools. Niobrara County, for example, has a little over 2,000 residents spread across more land than Rhode Island. Then there's Lost Springs, a town so small it's become a statistic instead of a place. At one point, it had a single resident, and today it has 6. This isn't rural in the way most Americans imagine rural. This is frontier living, and 17 of Wyoming's 23 counties officially qualify as frontier counties, meaning fewer than 6 people per square mile. Nearly half the state's population lives in places where the nearest neighbor might be miles away, not houses down the road. Now here's where Wyoming really breaks expectations. Empty usually means poor, but Wyoming flips that logic on its head. Despite its tiny population, the state quietly ranks among the richest in America on a per-person basis. Wyoming's per capita income is one of the highest in the country, landing near the top 3 depending on the year, and its real GDP per capita sits comfortably above the national average. All of this happens without a state income tax, no personal income tax, no corporate income tax, and no estate tax. That kind of setup usually comes with dense financial hubs or massive population bases, yet Wyoming has neither. What it does have is extraction: coal, oil, natural gas, bentonite, trona, and now resurging uranium. Wyoming supplies roughly 40% of America's coal, most of it pulled from the Powder River Basin by a small workforce overseeing massive operations. The money doesn't come from people, it comes from land. Minerals generate enormous revenue, which allows the state to fund itself without squeezing residents. In effect, Wyoming monetized its emptiness. What makes this model even more unusual is how invisible it is to outsiders, because Wyoming doesn't look rich. There are no glittering skylines or finance districts signaling wealth. Instead, the money moves quietly through royalties, severance taxes, and trust funds. Entire school systems and infrastructure projects are funded by minerals extracted miles away from the nearest town. In many states, prosperity follows people. In Wyoming, people follow prosperity only after the land has already done the work. This reverses the normal American growth story, and it's one reason Wyoming never needed millions of residents to function. The state learned how to survive and even thrive without density. Fewer people share the wealth, and the land does the heavy lifting. That's how the state can be rich, quiet, and sparsely populated all at once. And by the way, I break down states, cities, and towns across America like this regularly, so subscribe if you want more grounded analysis like this. Wealth and space alone don't explain why people stay away, because Wyoming charges a different kind of tax, and it's paid in weather. This is one of the coldest, windiest, highest states in the country. Winter here isn't a season, it's a presence. January lows regularly dip into single digits, and in some valleys below 0 is normal, while the record low sits at a brutal -66 degrees. Snow doesn't politely fall and melt. In the mountains, it stacks up by the hundreds of inches, and even the plains routinely see 60 or more inches a year. Then there's the wind. Wyoming wind isn't background noise. It howls, and gusts hit 40, 50, sometimes 70 miles per hour, shutting down highways and flipping semis like toys. Combine that with altitude, most of the state sits well above 6,000 feet, and daily life becomes harder than it looks on paper. Your car works harder, your body works harder. Simple errands become planning exercises, so for people used to convenience, Wyoming can feel hostile. And the hostility isn't dramatic, it's cumulative. It's the way wind never really stops, the way winter mornings punish unprepared cars, and the way a storm can erase your plans without apology. Wyoming doesn't overwhelm you all at once. Instead, it wears you down slowly, which is why people who move here on impulse often leave within a few years. Loving Wyoming requires more than admiration for scenery. It requires tolerance for friction. The state asks you to adapt to it, not the other way around. The landscape is stunning, but it does not cater to comfort, and that climate quietly filters out millions of would-be residents before economics ever enters the conversation. Even if you can handle the cold and the wind, Wyoming asks another question. How comfortable are you being far away from everything? This is one of the most isolated states in the lower 48. There are no megacities next door, no coastal corridors, and no dense regional networks pulling people in. Wyoming has just 3 interstate highways cutting across vast distances, and if you miss your exit, you might not see another town for 50 miles. Commercial air service exists, but it's limited and expensive. And then there's the detail that surprises a lot of people. Wyoming has no passenger rail service at all, no Amtrak. It's one of only 2 states in the contiguous U.S. without it. That isolation shapes daily life. Specialized healthcare often means long drives. Emergency response times stretch thin in frontier counties, and internet and cell coverage drop off fast once you leave town limits. Wyoming isn't built for speed or constant access. It's built for self-reliance. For some people, that's freedom. For most, it's a deal breaker. Here's where Wyoming really messes with people's expectations. You hear empty state and you assume housing must be dirt cheap everywhere. And in some places, it is. There are towns where you can still buy a house for the price of a new pickup truck. But then there's the other Wyoming, the one that looks like it belongs to a completely different country. Jackson Hole. This is where the numbers stop making sense. The average home price here is north of $7 million. Median prices hover in the multi-million range. Condos start around $1 million, and rentals can cost more per month than a mortgage in most states. This isn't driven by locals. It's driven by ultra-wealthy buyers parking money, buying second and third homes, and treating property like a long-term asset instead of shelter. The result is a split state. On one side are towns losing population, with cheap housing but no jobs. On the other are resort areas where teachers, nurses, and police officers can't afford to live anywhere near where they work. Wyoming is empty, but it isn't evenly empty. And that imbalance creates a strange psychological divide inside the state itself. In one town, housing is so affordable it feels disconnected from national reality, while in another, it's completely inaccessible to the people who keep the place running. The result isn't loud conflict, but quiet tension, not political outrage, but logistical frustration. Workers commute long distances, businesses struggle to staff, and communities rely on people who can't afford to live there. It isn't chaos, but it's fragile, and it reinforces why Wyoming resists growth narratives so aggressively. Expansion doesn't just bring people, it brings problems Wyoming has spent decades avoiding. And that imbalance quietly pushes people away just as much as the weather does. Wyoming looks busy on postcards, and nowhere is that clearer than Yellowstone. The park alone pulls in over 4.5 million visitors every year, which is about 8 times the state's entire population. In peak summer, some gateway towns feel overcrowded, traffic backs up for miles, and hotel prices explode. But here's the thing, tourism doesn't equal settlement. Most of those visitors leave. They don't stay, they don't put kids in schools, they don't open long-term businesses, and they don't build year-round communities. Tourism jobs are often seasonal, lower-paying, and unstable, and when winter hits, a lot of that work disappears. Yellowstone might generate hundreds of millions of dollars annually, but that money concentrates in small pockets and short time frames. Outside of tourism hubs, towns feel largely untouched by it. So Wyoming ends up with a strange rhythm, overwhelming crowds for a few months, followed by long stretches of quiet that feel almost abandoned. It's a state that hosts millions, but houses very few. Here's the part that rarely makes the highlight reel. Living in Wyoming means negotiating distance every single day. This is a state with just 3 interstates, long highways, and enormous stretches of nothing in between. There is no passenger rail, no Amtrak, and if you don't drive, you don't live here, at least not easily. Airports are small, flights are limited, and weather cancels plans without apology. A grocery run can mean 40 miles, while a specialist doctor might be 2 hours away. In frontier counties, emergency response times stretch long enough that self-reliance isn't a personality trait, it's survival math. Connectivity tells the same story. Outside of cities like Cheyenne or Casper, broadband drops off fast, and cell service disappears the moment you leave town. There are places where a flat tire isn't an inconvenience, but a problem you plan for in advance. This infrastructure reality doesn't scare tourists because they pass through quickly, but for permanent residents, it defines life. Wyoming rewards preparation, patience, and independence, and in doing so, it quietly filters out people who expect convenience on demand. And this is the final reason Wyoming stays empty, not because it lacks money, land, or beauty, but because it demands a version of living most Americans no longer practice. Wyoming isn't empty by accident. It's empty by choice, reinforced over generations by culture, values, and a deep suspicion of crowding. This is a state built around ranching logic, where land isn't scenery, it's livelihood. Space equals control, distance equals freedom, and density is often viewed not as efficiency, but as intrusion. That mindset still shapes how communities grow, how laws are written, and how development is received. You can see it in small decisions that never make headlines: zoning fights, resistance to large apartment complexes, and suspicion toward outside investors. Growth is debated not in terms of revenue, but disruption. How much traffic will this bring? How many people will it attract? What happens to the quiet? In Wyoming, those questions carry real weight because silence is treated like a resource, and once it's gone, it doesn't come back. Culturally, Wyoming leans hard into self-reliance. Guns aren't a statement here, they're tools. Government is tolerated, not trusted, and while property rights matter, so does leaving your neighbor alone. The social contract is simple: don't bother me, and I won't bother you. That works beautifully at low population levels, but scale it up and the system breaks. There's also the weather-forged personality of the place. Harsh winters, violent wind, and long distances don't just test infrastructure, they test people. Those who stay tend to share similar traits: patience, practicality, and a low tolerance for drama. Wyoming doesn't attract crowds because it doesn't flatter them. It doesn't offer anonymity through density or excitement through constant stimulation. Instead, it offers something quieter and harder to market: autonomy. This is why Wyoming resists becoming Colorado or Montana 2.0. Growth happens slowly, deliberately, and often reluctantly. The emptiness isn't a failure of planning, it's the outcome of values that quietly prioritize space over scale and independence over convenience. So the real question isn't why Wyoming is massive, rich, and empty. The real question is whether it can stay that way. On paper, Wyoming should be exploding. Remote work removes geography as a barrier, no state income tax makes it financially attractive, land is abundant, energy resources are resurging, especially uranium, and tourism keeps injecting outside money. And yet, population growth remains stubbornly slow. Part of that is structural. Nearly half the land is federally owned and off-limits to development. Infrastructure expansion is expensive when homes are spread miles apart. Healthcare and education systems struggle to scale without density, and extreme weather isn't getting milder, it's getting more volatile. These aren't small obstacles, they're population breaks. But part of it is philosophical. Wyoming doesn't chase growth the way other states do. It doesn't build massive housing tracts or bend zoning laws to attract volume, and communities debate growth intensely, often pushing back against it. Jackson Hole is the cautionary tale everyone cites: wealth flooding in, workers pushed out, prices exploding. The lesson Wyoming towns took wasn't grow faster, it was Be careful what you invite. Still, pressure is building. Climate migration will push people inland, Western water scarcity will reshape settlement patterns, and energy transition money is already flowing into the state. Wyoming may never be crowded, but it may become strategically important in ways it hasn't been before. And when that happens, the tension between wealth and emptiness will sharpen. Wyoming's future won't be decided by how much land it has. It will be decided by how much change it's willing to tolerate and how fiercely it protects the silence that made it what it is. Wyoming isn't a mystery once you stop expecting it to behave like the rest of America. It's massive because geography never forced it to compress. It's rich because minerals, energy, and tourism quietly do the heavy lifting. And it's empty because emptiness is part of the design, protected by climate, culture, land ownership, and choice. This state proves something uncomfortable. Growth isn't inevitable, and density isn't destiny. Wyoming exists as a reminder that in a crowded world, some places stay quiet not because they failed, but because they refused. And if this breakdown helped you see Wyoming differently, a like lets me know these kinds of analyses are worth continuing. If you're curious why so few Americans actually live in this massive stretch of the West Coast, this video breaks it down. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video.